You're watching Saturday Anime on the Sci-Fi Channel.
Greetings, this is Reverend Paul, and this is Studio Chojin RAW. And once again, I'm joined with Fairlie. How are you doing, Fairlie?
I'm okay, how are you?
I've been better. But today we're going to talk about Belladonna of Sadness.
Yes, I'm excited.
Belladonna of Sadness is an interesting movie because it's part of Osmoteska's anime Rama trilogy, where Osmoteska was experimenting with adult animation and sort of psychedelic animation. And there are 3 movies in the trilogy. So there's 1001 Nights, there's Cleopatra, and then Belladonna of Sadness is the third one. Have you seen the other movies in the anime Rama trilogy?
I have seen parts of the other movies, but I've not seen any of them in full. And I think it's mostly because even though Belladonna was the last one, and clearly there were changes in the animation to make up for some other things I'm sure we'll talk about here, the animation of the other ones didn't hold my attention quite the same. They seemed a little bit more ridiculous, and I couldn't quite pay attention to them the same way.
I watched all of them. I don't know, they're not very good, honestly.
Okay.
Cleopatra, I think, is terrible. It's really bad. I think 1001 Nights is better.
Yes.
But Cleopatra has a lot of this slapstick comedy in it, and I guess it's bawdy humor, and it just goes on for way too long. It's painful.
Yeah.
Where you'll have characters they'll drink something, and then they'll start mugging into the camera, and their faces are turning all colors, and it's like Looney Tunes, and it goes on way too long. And you have less of that in 1001 Nights, but they're not very good. And it's interesting that Belladonna of Sadness is the best one. It's the best film out of this trilogy, and it's also the film Osmoteska had the least involvement in. So I'm wondering if maybe he's not cut out for adult animation, or his idea of adult entertainment is vaudeville.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that, because that's, I think, what I totally, to use a very bad turn of phrase here, because it's not what I mean, turned me off of the other ones, where I specifically remember this one scene in Cleopatra where she's talking to, I guess it's Mark Anthony, and she pushes him off a balcony, but then somehow there's a trampoline and he bounces back up again, and I just went oh man, what? Why? Where? How? Sense? I don't know. And but Belladonna is a very elegant story, and it's a very beautiful thing to look at, which the others just aren't. So I think that's why I never really brought myself to finish any of the other films.
What's interesting to me is that when you think about anime, especially anime as invented by Osmoteska, it's a medium about limitations. So a lot of the style we associate with anime, these are things they created because of budgetary limitations. So, you have very static characters, reusing animation and loops and things like that. That use of budgetary constraints, that use of limitations, created the anime style as we know it. And so you have that same concept going with Belladonna of Sadness, where it is constrained by limited animation, but that limited animation is what informs the style and what makes it unique.
Absolutely. And I think that when I had read articles, and surprisingly few of them, about Belladonna and the animation style itself, a lot of people mention the references to classical artwork and stained glass and tarot and things like that. But very few people mention the fact that it was a limited budget to begin with. And by the third film in the series, they were even grossly beyond budget than they should have been, which meant that they had to even further kind of chop down their animation, and gave us this really beautiful limited motion movie. I can't imagine it any other way. It really is just stunning to look at, and I think it works very well for the story involved too.
How would you describe the plot?
Oh boy. Okay, so I guess elevator pitch would be, it's about a woman who comes to find her own agency and her rise and fall in feudal France through witchcraft. As
the song in the beginning tells us, it's about Jean and Jean.
Yes. Yes, they both have the same name.
So Jean and Jean, they get married, and then they have to go to I don't know if he's like the mayor, but he's like the nobleman of the village. They have to go to the nobleman of the village to approve of their union.
So it's actually based on, and they mention in the opening credits, but I hadn't realized exactly how closely it's actually based on La Sorcerie. And I'm going to apologize in advance. I don't speak French, so I'm going to butcher every name and I'm going to butcher every title. But it was based on a book by Jules Michelet called La Sorcerie. And it was republished in English under the title Satanism and Witchcraft, which I promise you it's not about what you're thinking by that title. But it's actually kind of a historical treatment of feudal France and the witch panic, I guess we can call it, that happened around those times through the lens of like 1860s feminism. It's a really fascinating book, but he does it in the form of a narrative. And the narrative that he lays out is actually the story of Belladonna of Sadness, where he talks about some of these laws that were in place to completely disenfranchise women. And one of them being that the Baron lord of the village had first right to what they called first fruits. So upon getting married, every woman was basically owed their virginity to the lord of the village. And there was a way out of this. There was often a dowry that could be paid, but usually this was an absurd amount of money or amount of livestock or crops that just were absolutely impossible for feudal peasants to have, let alone pay out. So it was apparently common practice to present your wife on your wedding night to the Baron of the village. And that's exactly where the story starts and what kind of leads to the temptation, I guess we can call it, in a very like religious sense, of this woman, Jean, who has the same name as her husband, also Jean. It really is a very interesting work, and apparently it actually informed a lot of American suffragism in the early age of the movement. It's a much more influential book than I ever thought it was, because it really does have this very strange like narrative quality.
So we basically have Jean and Jean, and then she goes to the nobleman, and then she's eventually violated by the nobleman, and then she's distraught by this. And then what I find interesting is that her husband tells her, we're going to forget about this. This never happened. And then later on, we have basically the crux of the story where the penis devil comes, and the penis devil is talking to her. He says something to the effect of anger and hate are not ugly. Basically telling her, to sort of embrace the way you're feeling. It's an interesting sort of juxtaposition we're getting between the reaction to the way she feels, where her husband is trying to tell her, just forget about this and we're going to pretend like it didn't happen. Where we have the penis devil telling her, no, you're angry, you hate these people, and you should feel that way. He is more accepting of her than her own husband is.
Yeah.
You could look at it as this metaphor for self-discovery in terms of like liberating yourself from this form of control, this idea of like being controlled by this system that she's being cast in with this nobleman and her husband that's violated her and feeling wronged by it. And now you have somebody telling you, no, this system is fucked, and you have a right to feel this way. And that is the beginning of where she kind of descends into like becoming a demon, or she's liberating herself, depending on how you want to read the story.
Yeah, and I think there's a very fine line between that, because I think that she does go through both kind of incarnations, if you will, where when she first surrenders to this demon, whatever it is, this spirit that seduces her basically, and again, however you want to read that, whether that's just her own agency or whether it is an outside like possessive force, her first kind of incarnation is as this very vibrant, kind of show-offy, woman of town, to the point where she almost has this kind of like internal rivalry with the woman of the castle, like the noble woman who is the actual lord's wife, and they kind of are pitted against each other in this very strange competitive way. And through this rise to power as, the tax collector's wife, she gets her husband a job as the like town tax collector, and her like public admiration. She actually kind of brings about her own ruination beyond even what she experienced in the beginning as just a peasant, where she's stripped of her fine clothes and chased out of town. Her husband turns his back on her, and she's kind of forced to become this wild woman, so to speak, where she now communes with herbs and kind of reconnects with the earth in this very inherently natural feminine way. And it's through that which she ends up being able to cure people of ailments, and there's a rise in plague, and she's able to help these plague victims with her knowledge of the earth. But it's almost as if she first is possessed by this idea of grandeur, and then after she realizes that that in itself is not going to sustain her, finds this very natural power. So I think it's kind of both. It's both a possession from this outside influence, this demonic possession, and then it's raw self-agency. And it's very impressive the way this narrative is woven. And this is where I think, the movie absolutely does it so much better than the source material, because the source material is a little bit ridiculous in a lot of ways. And I could easily see it going the way of the early anime-rama films in a way, because there's a lot of caricaturization that happens in this, historical narrative. It's done so beautifully and so elegantly in the film. It's actually a little empowering, which is what surprises me when I see so often people will write articles or criticisms, or, every once in a while the movie will show up as like a midnight showing back when movie theaters were a thing. And people will talk about how disempowering it is for women and how violent and unnecessary a lot of it is. And I wholeheartedly disagree with that. I think it really is a beautiful story of self-empowerment, regardless of how it ends.
Belladonna of Sadness to me is basically the Matrix. It's this story about a person who has been told that you are ordinary and you need to fall in line with everybody else. They're being taught not to believe in themselves, because the truth of it is, if they do believe in themselves, they can do anything. Think about sexuality and the way sexuality is used in the story. So she's violated by this nobleman. But then interestingly enough, we have the devil that comes to her as this little penis demon. So he's almost like a sex toy. She's now sort of taking control of sexuality, through this sort of sex toy devil, versus before where the sexuality is being thrusted upon her. And that use of sexuality is that sort of vector for this idea of you are capable of more than this system wants you to think you are. The sexuality is a metaphor for liberation, and it does tie into that whole idea of like the sexual liberation of the 60s. And you can't help but wonder if they're inspired by that.
I have to admit that I was not able to look into that historical aspect of it, but I would absolutely, I wouldn't be surprised at all, obviously, because it was so pervasive in other parts of the world at the time. And there has always been this idea of women's sexuality being really the source of their own empowerment, and taking control of your sexuality will empower you against whatever oppression you might be facing. As a woman. And as anybody really, but especially, women. And that's kind of the point of, again, the source material, the sorcery, is that when you take agency away from women, and witchcraft historically was, let's be real, they weren't really persecuting witches, so to speak. A lot of the people, especially in Europe, because the European witch hunts were very, very different from the American witch hunts, but in Europe, a lot of the people who were being persecuted as witches were medicine people. They were women who were able to treat disease and or control birth rate, which was actually seemingly the historical impetus towards the witch hunts. Because feudalism was a movement that thrived on bodies. The more people you had working your land, the more profitable you were as a lord. So obviously you want those people to continue to reproduce at the best rate possible. And there were absolutely women who were able to prescribe herbs and treatments to prevent pregnancy and to prevent exhaustion and all of these other things that they really didn't necessarily want people to have knowledge of. And there's a lot of work that has come out, especially around the time that Belladonna, the film, was done, to suggest that a lot lot of this was about controlling women's sexuality, and I'm not surprised at all that it would come about in that time when, birth control suddenly is now, a much more pervasive thing, and it gave women a lot more agency in that time. So it definitely, I think, had that whole historical precedence, and it was another repeat of a historical cycle that I think led probably to this being released at the time that it was, or being made in the time that it was.
It is like The Matrix in the sense that, now when people look at The Matrix because of the Wachowskis, they interpret it as this metaphor for being trans. But I think The Matrix works because it's a metaphor that works on, many different levels. You could look at it as being trans, you could look at it as being gay or politics. It's this idea of control, a system that's controlling you. And I feel like you can do the same thing with Belladonna of Sadness, where you could look at it as the subjugation of women, but it's also a greater metaphor for control. This idea of male and female, you could look at them almost as stand-ins for just classes, in terms of like the people with power versus the people without power. And the fact that, even though you feel powerless, you do have power. And in order to achieve that power, you need to kind of embrace the things the society wants to tell you are forbidden. In this regard, we get the devil. The devil is that stand-in for that forbidden aspects of power. He's that gateway into finding your own liberation.
Forbidden knowledge, absolutely, I think, is what the devil, especially if you're talking about stories of witchcraft, tends to represent. It's just the things that you're not supposed to know, and yet are promised to you through this pursuit of something equally forbidden. And yet, ultimately, that is knowledge of things that are completely natural. She's not given knowledge of the inner workings of the political climate of the time. She's given knowledge of her own self and the earth around her, and this innate sense of pride and self-mastery. And those are not things that you necessarily need someone else to introduce to you. Those are things that can only come from intense self-knowledge. So the idea that this is the forbidden thing, the most taboo thing, is for you to know yourself and the environment that you live within, is, I think, really fascinating and something that has never disappeared. It's still seemingly the most taboo thing that you could possibly learn.
Even though the movie came out, almost 50 years ago or whatever, or 40 years ago, it still has a lot of resonance now, and it speaks a lot to the style of the movie.
Yeah, I think it's such a timeless story that it really, the way that the film is produced, it's this very kind of fairy tale, this very elegant fairy tale, and they use these beautiful watercolors and this very dreamy motion that comes from that very limited animation style. And she also, as a character, is drawn very differently throughout the film, which I thought was very interesting. When I first saw this movie, I was way too young to have seen this movie. This was one of those things that it's like someone had burned to like a, DVD and brought on a field trip somewhere, and we just watched because we thought it was a porn. And I was way too young to grasp any of the nuance of it, but I knew it was still beautiful to look at. But as someone who is a little more introspective watching this as an older person, everything seems to be such a conscious choice. And the way that she's drawn from the beginning is very, very human. She has beautiful blonde hair, and she's got these big, beautiful eyes, and she looks very innocent and like the fairy tale heroine. And as the story continues, she's done in these wild colors. Her hair turns all these beautiful, like flowery colors, and even her skin changes from like white to silver to purple to all these different kaleidoscope colors. And of course, then there's this very psychedelic animation sequence towards the end where if you're not totally enwrapped in the story, it can just kind of seem like maybe a moment of the time.
The psychedelic orgy scene?
Yeah.
My favorite part is where the dude's shooting fish out of his ass.
Yeah, it's this very like Hieronymus Bosch like psychedelia thing. But like every single one of these things, and even the fact that like she's drawn larger in scale as the film goes on. All of these things are really incredible visual metaphors for the progress of her character, as far as she goes from this child within the feudal system to a woman of self-possession. And the only way to really get this across is through this really interesting drawing progression that her character actually goes through. It's so beautiful to look at, and yet it absolutely tells tells the story of the source material of La Sorcerie. However, when you're reading the book, it has none of the beauty and the elegance, really, that the film does. There's a few moments, especially where the dialogue with the devil comes in. The dialogue that the devil engages in is a very elegant interplay, but it's still not nearly as beautiful as this film is. And the moments where the devil is speaking to her, there's just something about the quality of this very fluid animation with the voice actor they got to do that voice was, I think, great. It's so seductive that even just watching it, you go yeah, I'd make that pact.
The way she's drawn, she actually, to me, she looks like Sharon Tate.
Mm-hmm.
Which I'm wondering if that was intentional.
I wouldn't be totally surprised, even if just because, Sharon Tate really was an icon of the time. And granted, this was made after the death, I believe, and now I'm questioning myself. This was 72, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I thought so. So yeah, Sharon Tate was iconic for years before and years after.
This movie, too, I think, was a big influence on the whole, definitely something like Urusuke Doji and all the kind of hentai sex demon movies that came out in the later 80s and early 90s, and especially the devil, the way he's portrayed with that deep, billowing voice with the reverb. Every anime demon, has that voice now. You can't deny the influence this movie had. And even the sex scenes, makes me think about The Wall when they had the flowers. And it's interesting too, because I do think that if this was made the same way they made the other anime Rama movies, it wouldn't work.
No.
The one scene in this movie where she resurrects that guy, was that guy Michael or whatever, where she cures him of the plague, that has more animation than the rest of the film. And that's kind of a comedy scene, especially the way the characters are flailing around and their expressions. It's kind of goofy. And that's basically how the other anime Rama movies are. If the entire movie was like that scene, this would be a much different film.
Yeah, I really do think that the hyper-limited animation makes it as stunning as it really is. And I think that because it really is such a fairy tale, it needs to be done in a way that makes you feel as if you are reading a book. This book is coming to life in front of you. But that's still done with a sort of dreaminess. It wouldn't work if it was too cohesive. And I think that's also what kind of, because this is absolutely the first film in this series that I saw. I didn't even watch clips of the other ones until after I'd seen and completely loved this movie. And that's what sets it apart. It really is just so much more elegant. And I think that's because of the way they chose to do it, or the way they had to do it. Because I'm quite sure that budgetary restrictions played a large part in why so few scenes were as animated as they were.
It definitely was a benefit because Mushi Pro, who did the animation for this, did the animation for the other movies. It did the animation for Astro Boy and Kimba and Ishida no Joe. Their experience was mostly in a lot of family-friendly comedy stuff. So it does seem like in some regards they couldn't help themselves, that's what they knew. So if they were going to do full animation, it was going to be that way, whether they wanted it to be or not.
Yeah, the way that it was done, it had to be done that way. And I think that the way that it was colored and, again, so limited animation almost made it more psychedelic, I think, than it would have been. There's that one really strange sequence where it seems like the animation just explodes everywhere. People will point to and be like, oh wow, yeah, there's this really psychedelic sequence of animation that happens, and it's I think the whole thing is much more psychedelic than that one sequence ever could be, because it's changing, it's fluid. Despite the fact that there's so much stillness, it doesn't really sit still. And I think it just adds to this flow of the story.
Well, I think also the score plays a big part in the style of the film, that, 70s score, which as I'm watching the movie, I am kind of wondering, why has that aesthetic not come back? Everybody keeps going back to the synth sounds of the 80s, but that kind of jazzy 70s sound, the only person who really does that is Tarantino. He'll have a lot of 70s music in his movies, but you don't really see that in a lot of movies anymore. So it's it definitely gives the movie a feel that's very unique.
Yeah, the soundtrack is incredible, and it's actually done by a fairly well-regarded Japanese jazz musician whose name I totally am blanking on. I have it on vinyl because it's so incredible to listen to, not even just, it doesn't even, it can be separated from the animation and still hold all of the wonder that it has in there, maybe aside from that opening track, which is a little bit ridiculous, but...
well, it's catchy, it's in my head head, that
really,
Jean and Jean.
It is really catchy, but like the rest of the score is so amazing. And yes, it is that really like psychedelic jazz style. And you're right, it hasn't really come back ever in the same way. Although I do have to say, I've heard a couple bands, like specifically bands recently, that seem to be playing a little bit more to that psychedelic jazz style. And it makes me wonder if it is going to come back a little bit. I definitely haven't seen it in any films, but I think that's also because it's so specific to a time. You hear that and you know it's the 70s. There's really no mistaking that feel. I think that's why Tarantino tends to go a little bit more that way. And even if you've seen a couple of the like recent seasons of Fargo, there's definitely some historical callbacks and they use some of these very distinct 70s sounds in the soundtrack, and it's great. It works so well, but you know that they're referencing a time, you know?
Because I mean, you watch like even like something like Fritz the Cat, and it does kind of have that same kind of feel to it with the score, even though they're wildly different movies.
They are, but yet they feel like they're not. I think that the idea of like animation, I know I've certainly thought of it in the past as like animation is either for kids or it's like it's not as nuanced and interesting as, you know, some like live action films, and yet like Fritz the Cat's another great example of a story that really like it's comedic and it's funny, but it really does address a lot of things that are not funny and very difficult to kind of summarize in a story, but it does it so well. And that's another one where the score is great. Like it's catchy, but it's still good. And it's I mean they were done fairly close together, weren't they?
Yeah, they had to be. Oh well, let's look it up. We'll edit this part out of the video.
I think they were similar eras.
Oh, 72. When did Belladonna of Sadness come out?
I think 72.
Okay, yeah, so Fritz the Cat and Belladonna of Sadness both came out in 1972. I would have thought Belladonna of Sadness influenced Fritz the Cat, but evidently they somehow came to the same weird kind of place.
It was the zeitgeist.
I guess so. That 60s ideology, you know, that free love, the music, you know, maybe that was just much more widespread than you think it was. It was actually sort of infiltrating Japan, and these older Japanese dudes were, you know, getting sucked into the counterculture.
I do have to say that I was surprised watching Belladonna that it's not a more female-driven production, I guess you could say. Like, it is bunch of Japanese dudes who made this thing, but even the source material was a man who wrote this material. So like, despite the fact that, and I think a lot of critics point to this as kind of a detraction, despite the fact that it's a largely male-driven version of this narrative in a male-driven production of the story, I personally think it captures a lot of feminine experience very, very well. And I was a little bit surprised by that. So I don't think this is a hyper-masculinized vision of this story.
No, I don't think so either. I think it's because the metaphor works on different levels.
Yeah.
As a woman, you can connect with it. If you're a man and you feel like you're subjugated, you could also still connect with it. That to me is when a metaphor in a story is working effectively, where everybody could respond to it equally, regardless of their situation.
I agree. I personally can only see it from one way, but I think that's the beauty of it, is that it's done so well that you can read a lot into it in different aspects. Obviously, it was written based on this story of feudalism and class struggle and witchcraft as a solution to empowerment, but there's also a long tradition in literature of like the demon lover trope, which would be a very different kind of narrative that it also kind of plays into. So like, there's a lot of different things working at the same time to give us the story as it's done. And I have no problems with it whatsoever. I don't think, one of the things that I really came up against a lot when I was kind of reading into the history of the production itself was a lot of people have a lot of issue with the sexual violence and they find it gratuitous and unnecessary. And I think that it not only is necessary, it's required for the story and the history that it plays into. I think that it works both on a literal level, because again, we're talking about very real laws that existed in feudal era, but it also works on a metaphorical level. It's more nuanced than I think a lot of people want to allow it to be. And I think that we would do ourselves an incredible disservice to just dismiss this as gratuitous, violent, sexual, whatever it is that you want to dismiss it based on.
Well, even the sexual violence in the movie is presented in this kind of abstract, stylistic way. So, I mean, I don't understand how anybody could have an issue with it, because it's not being presented in any kind of realistic way. I mean, it's very clearly, to me, it's a very clear metaphor. But, I mean, even if it wasn't, it's still taking place in this kind of abstract, artful way. You know, it's not like it's this cold, you know, we see this rape in this cold clinical detail, like irreversible, you know? It's being done in this sort of artful way that, to me, lessens the violence, because to me, it doesn't seem like a violent movie at all. I mean, I guess when you start to unpack the ideas of it, it is pretty violent. But the way it's presented in this very artful way, and it softens a lot of the darkness of it. It makes it a lot, I mean, I hesitate to say it makes it more palatable, but it makes it easier to digest.
Well, it turns it into a fairy tale. But let's be real, fairy tales were grotesque and gruesome, and there was a lot of violence within them. I think the abstraction actually makes it a little bit more powerful, because it's that same way where you can look at it as metaphor, you can look at it as just this kind of literary trope that moves along the story, or you can see it as what it is, and that's that it was a pervasive thing of the time. And I say of the time, not of the 70s, I mean of the time when the story itself was written. Sorry, my dog just came over and banged right into the microphone. Sorry, dog totally tripped me up here. And that's, you know, it was so pervasive that nobody really thought anything of it until now. And this is really the story of someone who kind of uses that injustice to create a better life for herself and for her family. And I think that there's power in that. It's not gratuitous violence without reason. It's violence that actually begets better, if that makes any sense.
But it's like, well, I agree with what you're saying. And it's so stylized, it's disconnected from reality. So it's like anybody to me who would take an issue with the violence or the sexuality is just somebody who is just like ultra conservative in what they want to see in entertainment. Because if this is a porno movie, it's the worst porno movie in the world, because these sex scenes are so stylized, there's nothing even really overtly sexual about it. It's done in such an artful manner that, like, I can't see any, like, you know, anybody buying this because they want to jerk off to it. Like, you would be so disappointed.
That's also why I'm so surprised that it was as masculine a production as it was, because as a woman watching this, it doesn't matter that the sex itself is much more conceptual and abstract, because it's still really sexy. But I think that's also the difference between, like, I'm gonna be as like blatant as I can here. Porn meant for men versus porn meant for women. Like, I think that it's erotic, but it's not pornographic. And in a way, it makes it sexier, which I think is an inherently feminine way to look at it.
I would describe it as an erotic movie. To me, it's not like stimulating. You know, it's not like, oh my God, I'm getting hot watching this movie. Like, I never, to me, it's just like you're using these ideas as metaphor, but then it could be because I'm looking at this with a male sensibility.
I think it's one of the many different layers of the film where, depending on how you come into this, I think it is a very stimulating film. But again, I think it's that eroticism versus pornography. And this is definitely not porn, but it is still, I think, incredibly erotic. So there is that too. But also, again, you know, we're looking at a story that is about ultimately female sexuality and the power that it holds. And there is kind of this increasing stimulation throughout the film as she continues to grow in her own power. And I think there's something very inherently sexy about that. But yeah, is it something you're gonna buy to please yourself to on your own? Probably not. It's not that kind of film.
Going back to what you said about the movie as kind of this play on female sexuality, if you want to look at it that way, it's interesting that her sexuality is unveiled through a male character. If you're looking at it that way, then it's almost saying that female sexuality is linked to male sexuality, or the doorway to female sexuality is through a man.
Well, it's actually unveiled, I think, between two male characters, because she enters into this world of sexuality through her husband, and not even necessarily her husband, but by marrying her husband, she's sacrificed to the village lord, and this introduces her to this world of pain that she had not previously been in. And then you have the devil character that actually, I think, more than anything, represents kind of like the Jungian animus. So it's the masculine part of her, or at least that's how I viewed it, but I read way too much psychology, so that could be my problem. But it's kind of the masculine drive that's awakened within her, and by integrating this into herself, by becoming one with this masculine character, she's able to expand her power beyond what she ever thought it could be, and others see this and recognize it in her. And ultimately, that might not be such a great thing for her, considering, but I don't know if we can say it's through an external masculine character. I think there's an internal masculine and an external masculine at work here, and ultimately it's that internal masculine that creates the whole feminine self that she becomes.
No, I agree with what you're saying, because this is the thing. As we've stated by the awesome song in the beginning, there's Jean and Jean. They both have the same name.
Yes.
You could look at Jean and Jean as two sides of the same character. So her husband is her repressed sexuality, or the part of her that is meant to conform with society. And the whole idea that the devil is presented to us as almost this sex toy-like character, or sex toy-like thing, that could be interpreted as her taking control of her own pleasure. So this idea of these male characters are actually just internal parts of her. I completely agree with that. That makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I think that her husband actually is kind of a non-character if you think about it. He doesn't really have any distinguishing personality traits or character development throughout it, and really is kind of more of a tool to drive the story along. Everything that she does, early on at least, is out of love for her husband and out of a desire to make their life together better. So she gives herself more or less willingly to the village lord. She puts herself in a position of power so that he can become the tax collector and they can progress in life. All of these early things are out of love for her husband, but he himself doesn't really necessarily have any real character arc other than losing his hand, which I think also could present him as more of a metaphorical object than a physical, tangible thing. But I still think, despite all of that, that he does represent the external side of it. Like you said, he's the fall in line with society side of this. And in fact, even going back to La Sorcerie, her husband in the book is just this kind of impotent, content to be where he is, surrender to whatever I have to do to not get killed person. And in fact, in the book, at least, when she's kind of torn apart by the townspeople, when her reckoning comes for being too grand a lady of town, he actually turns his back on her because the money that they've collected means more to him than any sort of familial love. And that's kind of her breaking point, at least in the book, where she previously had not fully given herself over to Satan, quote unquote, but does so after she realizes that her husband will never fulfill her in the way that she can fulfill herself through this pursuit of, again, forbidden knowledge, which ultimately is just self.
And it is interesting how you could also look at the movie the way it parallels the 60s counterculture, the way the free love movement was in contrast to the sort of conservative suit and tie of the previous generation.
Yeah, and also I think that there's a large body of philosophical work done on that era as far as pointing to kind of the death of family culture and the rise of individualism, really, in youth culture and what is projected as the best possible ideal outcome. And this is definitely a story of someone who thinks that she's getting into that ideal family life. You know, she gets married and she's going to be the woman of the house and probably have a family. And in fact, what she ends up finding is her destiny as an individual and the individual power that she holds that nobody else can give to her. So I think it really is kind of a timeless story of very modern times.
Yeah, that is definitely true. I think, I mean, if you were to take like a director like Yoshiaki Kawajiri, because I actually think his style actually reminds me a little bit of the style of Belladonna of Sadness with the long faces. If Kawajiri was to do a modern update of Belladonna of Sadness, it would be interesting. It would definitely be interesting to watch this sort of play out with that kind of like Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust Ninja Scroll aesthetic. I think it would fit. But going back to what you're saying, if you were to do that with the movie, if you were to do a sort of more traditional anime approach, I think that would actually make the movie be more male, and it would sort of lose that female aesthetic that you were describing. It would make it much more aggressive.
I agree. I think that the abstractness of it, that dreamy kind of incomplete quality, definitely drives the femininity of it. I don't think it would work in a fully animated, frame-for-frame, fluid style.
I mean, it is interesting, too, that when you think about these anime Rama movies, is that they're all they're Japanese productions, but they're not about Japan. You know, one is about Arabian Nights, one is about Egypt, this one's about, you know, medieval France. So it is interesting that these Japanese filmmakers chose to do these kind of experimental stories and not put it in a Japanese environment, put it elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that you could argue, certainly, that like 1001 Nights and Cleopatra, you know, being about these very exotic locations could just be exoticism for the sake of exoticism. But I mean, you certainly wouldn't look at medieval France and think, wow, what an exotic atmosphere, because it was, I think, universally agreed upon that medieval France was a terrible place to live if you were not a lord. And even if you were, it's probably still a pretty filthy, gross place to live. But it is definitely, they are distinctly not Japanese stories. And yet, Belladonna, I think, has at least established itself somewhere in a canon of like really influential, important anime.
It makes me wish that I was more like familiar with like Japanese culture, because if you want to find a through line through this trilogy, maybe it is commenting on the conservativeness of Japanese society and this idea of embracing sexuality as this idea of, once again, embracing the forbidden knowledge. If you want to look at these films as a whole, as a commentary on the conformity of the Japanese existence. I mean, I could speculate, but because I'm not Japanese, I'm not really in a position to say, well, that's what these movies are doing.
Yeah, I think that there's a certain sense of like cycle that I think you can kind of trace, because again, this is based on a story that was written in 1862, was when La Sorcerie was originally published. And certainly in 1862, they were already worlds away from feudal France. But in 1862, you begin to have the rise of a very different political uprising, movement, I guess you could say. And then this film is made in 1972, which is well after 100 years later, and yet it's also around a shift, a global shift in politics and political thought. And I think that anytime you start to see this great disparity in power and power placement, stories like this do tend to come up. I mean, if you think about even right now with what I do and the arena that I work in, I'm seeing a whole lot more popularity and drive to exploration than I ever have before. And I think that the only thing that you can really point to is this political unrest and people's deep need for empowerment when it feels like the system is rigged against them. And I think that's what this story is about. I think that's what this story has always been about. And I think that's why you start to see stories like this pop up here and there at different points in history.
I mean, it is kind of funny that this is a movie we chose to review now where it's very relevant. It's kind of strange that way, but it's definitely a movie. I mean, there are people, you know, who may be apprehensive of watching older things like from the 70s. They may think it's dated or something like that, but this is definitely something, if you exist today, you will find something to relate to. It's a story that, you know, transcends time and language, you know, and even your gender. It's a story everybody can find something to connect with.
It's absolutely evergreen. I don't think there will be a time where this will seem outdated.
I think that's a pretty high recommendation we would give to Belladonna of Sadness. We think people should go check this out. Their lives will be enriched by watching it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree that this is a film that you should watch.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely recommend people go check it out. I think the 70s in general is kind of an overlooked period of anime. I was going through the list of trying to find like older 70s animation because I was playing a Yatterman video game and it just made me want to go back and watch old Yatterman episodes, and then I became obsessed with just the whole 70s aesthetic. I found this list of 70s anime and I was trying to like find ways to watch them, if I could buy them, if I could stream them somewhere. And there's a lot of the tokusatsu stuff is out there, but a lot of, anime from the 70s just seems to be lost. Belladonna of Sadness is definitely a good gateway for people to get into 70s anime.
Absolutely. I think even if you're not necessarily into anime, it's a really beautiful film to kind of introduce the style. I've definitely showed this to people who've never watched anime before, and they're just like, wow, I didn't realize it could be so beautiful and nuanced. And I'm like, yeah, where have you been? It
is pretty cool. So is there anything you want to promote? Is there anything you want people to know about?
Geez. Wow. I mean, I'm going to be getting back into doing my own videos. I actually chopped up my sofa recently because it was clogging up my filming area, and now we have nowhere to sit and I have no reason not to do videos. So I'm gonna be getting back into that. But I started a podcast. Hex and Heal is the name of my podcast. I interview different people in the arena of spirituality and get an idea of the background of their belief systems and how people can kind of work some of these ideas into their own lives. And I am definitely much more active on Instagram. I like static pictures. I'm not really a moving picture kind of person, but I'm trying to get back into that. But you can find me on Instagram at Fairlie Theta, just my name. And I will have videos up soon though, again. I'm hoping to get that back together.
That sounds cool. I'll put the links for that in the description of the video. I also want to let everybody know that I'm available for art commissions. You could send me a DM on Twitter at studiochojin. You could send me an email at studiochojin@gmail.com. If you like the Studio Chojin videos, if you enjoyed this discussion, you could always donate to Studio Chojin on Coffee. And I guess that's all we got to say for today. So this is Reverend Paul for Fairlie Theta saying, until we meet again.